Yeah, I think Bruce has a question actually. So go ahead,
Yeah,
Bruce.
I see her. Yeah, raising hand is great.
Yes, so I've been working hard on a really bad acronym. And so I'd like to propose the OSETI OMG, which stands for the Optical Multi-Field Great Campaign. And so I think fun as a test of all of our instruments and capabilities, if we decided that there was a good time, maybe every other year or something like this, to everybody pile on and observe the same area of sky. It might be fun if we all thought of a really good time to do it, like a time when, for example, Swift was looking at the galactic plane and LSST started up, VRO started up, and something like that. And maybe DECAM is pointing near at the same time. That might be a fun and cool project to do. I'm starting an optical instrument called the UFA camera for ultrafast astronomy. And, we'll do our little tests by ourselves. It would be more fun if we were, had part of a field that many other people were looking at. For example, that UCSD project.
I'll just comment based from the LSST perspective. There are certain fields, special fields in the survey, like they call them the deep drilling fields, where they'll visit them with much higher cadence. And then you can think of other special areas of sky, like the goods field or continuous viewing zones from various surveys like TESS. I think there are some smart areas we could pick, which would be much easier to facilitate overlap.
I guess one question I have is, are there any organizing forums for this sort of activity to be captured? I know that there are some working groups, and one of the things we're hoping to do is under the LSSTC is to actually start an optical technosignatures working group. But if we can think of mechanisms that we can enable to keep going with this communication, I think other than a web page, which we'll obviously try to do, and we will capture this stuff and put it on a site. Maybe we should already start planning our next in-person workshop somewhere. I think that actually might be a good activity if people want to think about hosting. Surely this will all be behind us soon.
I'm curious what people think of the SPIE workshops, and sometimes they have special sessions for optical SETI. Is that sufficient for our needs? Is there something we need beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, like this is a fairly targeted, although it's quite impressive that there have been essentially 50 people throughout both days for the whole time. It's nice to have a range, right? A targeted set where you kind of really get a small focus group together. This actually, in many ways, is quite disparate, as well as then piggybacking on SPIE. But it is great to piggyback on those conferences because all the infrastructure is set up and you have a wide audience. As Lucian points out, SPIE is focused on instrumentation, so not everyone.
It's not. You're right. It's not so much data analysis and things that we need about looking at big databases.
And Bruce actually does point out, I think, what is something that will be good going on. One of the good things about this is it has forced us to get used to Zoom. And although we all are sick of it, it really does enable wider groups to get together more easily, even if you have an in-person component. And I think given the new tools, you can actually effectively have in-person and people calling in. Shelley?
And reduce carbon footprint.
And reduce carbon, absolutely.
I'm hopeful that most conferences will be hybrid from now on for those reasons. And as Lucian pointed out, SPI is good for instrumentation, but I think we need to think bigger here and try to make sure if there is a workshop that it's maybe a separate session in the AAS. And so those efforts at the AAS would be good to incorporate. One of the most pleasing things I've seen in the last 2 days is all these wonderful talks where we're talking about major surveys. I mean, these are #1 surveys, and we're trying to incorporate technosignatures in it. And the longevity and the success of this field is bringing in junior people and making sure this spreads. The comment I wanted to talk about really here is planning for success. So we have all of these programs here, and as Ruben's going to do, it's going to generate a lot of candidates. And it's not clear, the multi-messenger and transient uses the telegram really efficiently for things that trigger in the night sky. And I think one of the most important things to come out of a collaboration or network, I think it's really an optical SETI network, is that when we do get candidates, we flag it and it's able to be used at all of our facilities that are doing multi-wavelength and multiple time resolutions. This is going to take a coordinated effort across all of their telescopes. So we really need to plan for success and follow up.
Hey, Shelley, that's a good idea. The FRB people have a really good network set up now for really quick alerts and slewing over their telescopes. And I wonder if we could copy that or even just use that network, but put in a little flag. This is the OSETI, put in some metadata so people don't have to look at our stuff if they don't want to.
And Bruce threw down the gauntlet that GRBs are faster than FRB networking. So,
yeah, well,
the challenge has been thrown.
We should use that.
Yeah,
network.
how about a an optical SETI or a SETI alert network to parallel the GCN? In other words, this isn't about you get the alert the next day is really way too slow for this kind of a thing, potentially.
Hi, I wanted to chime in on the alerts. So, a lot of the existing alert networks that are used for like gamma ray bursts and whatnot, I think the thing to think about, so from the Rubin Observatory point of view, right, there's no special like kinds of alerts, right? There are brokers, so there are alerts that go out. The alert stream is huge because it's everything that changes, including like moving objects, including variable stars that are totally like uninteresting from a transient point of view, anything that changes. But you will have access to alert streams via brokers that will allow us to define different kinds of filters or criteria that would define what constitutes an alert. And I put this in the chat. The reason there's no OSETI alert system, right, is that what constitutes an alert is very different, even for the speakers within this conference. And I wanted to flag something because the GRB conversation came up. One thing to think about, and I think this is a reason that this particular group of people in attendance here have an advantage, is that in the era of Rubin, you are going to be competing for follow-up resources. If you don't have your own follow-up resources, you will be competing with every astronomer on Earth who works on transients. And that means that the things like speed, like low latency turnaround for follow-up observations may or may not be necessary depending on the nature of the alert, right? And so maybe you need to enter that fray, or maybe, following up a month later on an alert is totally sufficient. So, it's not just a binary world of like alert or not alert, or candidate or not candidate. There's a lot of details in here that guide strategy and what that looks like for the next decade.
Gregory, you had your hand up.
So something that I've found a bit tricky as a grad student that entered this field is the lack of easily accessible and recent information about it. In that, although there hasn't been a review paper that I could find from like the last 10 years, and the field has changed dramatically since then. So we should try to start figuring out ways to not only discuss, but disseminate information, especially recent information about the field and the techniques and the instruments, as they're now all very desperate, and piecing it all together is quite difficult.
Absolutely. That's an excellent point. Go ahead.
Who? Me?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry.
So I guess I have kind of a curveball thought process, which kind of I think incorporates a lot of what's already been said. But like, I am thinking about smaller universities, which don't typically have radio capabilities, but do potentially do often have like optical capabilities. And so there are a lot more small universities than there are big universities, and they may not have giant observatories, but they have collectively a lot of capability. So I know that for like, there's a KELT FUN project, which has contributed to discovering exoplanets. My alma mater is like 1,600 people, but with like 4 physics majors, but they helped contribute because they were part of this kind of collaboration of small universities, which kind of pool their resources to do this sort of large eyes or many eyes approach. And if we have just so many alerts, it would be helpful to have kind of an organizing body to distribute it to the smaller, less capable universities, which are distributed across the country, across the world. It would be good to have kind of an organizing body which kind of organizes what ideas are currently being pursued, what the current research is, and it brings in students who don't go to those larger universities, which don't have the resources or necessarily the expertise to get involved with kind of the ongoing optical SETI work. So I guess I'm kind of just thinking about the potential for smaller universities to contribute in a way to SETI research, which they never have before because it hasn't been as optically focused until more recently. And I was kind of inspired a lot by like what Steve was saying about the contributions of undergraduates and how much they've done, and how like just with proper guidance, undergraduates are able to do a lot of really invaluable work.
I will point out that there are an order of magnitude more optical astronomers than radio astronomers. So that's where the bulk of the field is. Stanton, you had your hand raised?
Yes. What I was thinking in terms of alerts was, we're not likely to anytime soon, people will argue with that, have a real discovery, but if you see a pulse or something, if somebody sees a 10 microsecond pulse or 100 microsecond pulse, I could follow up with my telescope, but I don't know. I have no way to find out if anybody has seen anything optically, and I think that if you had just some way to just communicate short messages, here's an object that's interesting, or we saw a flash and at these celestial coordinates, others of us could take a look at it, and it would also give a means for all these diverse, which are very interesting efforts, to give a little bit of status every now and then as to whether they're going on. It's not really an alert system because it's not like having a gamma ray burster or something where everybody knows what it is, but it's just a way to communicate a little better than come together every now and then in a conference. So that's my thought.
Yeah, that's great. And I think radio, we'd want to, be able to point to. Before we go on, we are into the next discussion session that John is going to leverage. So I don't know, John, you want to take over if you have any kind of initial thoughts, and then we'll go right back into basically the discussion.
Yeah, sure. So let me just circle back to what Craig Fruiter ideas. So that is one of my original goals of organizing this workshop, is that to put more information out there and to synthesize more or less broad landscape of optical SETI, so that we are aware of what other teams are doing, and also to gather information, and hopefully if things go well at the end of this workshop, I will try to synthesize into either a white paper or a review paper on what we have gathered in this workshop, and so on, discuss, and then to put it out there for the community so that it can serve as a kind of a starting point of collaborating at a wider scale, and then to think about the success of how we can for example, follow up and then also to synthesize more concurrent observation. So yeah, that's the idea. So back to you, Jeff.
Oh no, I think we're in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
I don't. Did Shelley, had you raised your hand before I?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on this follow-up discussion. I really appreciate Lucienne's discussion on the intricacies of this, right? And we can build off a lot of infrastructure. The challenge, right, for this is that how all of our systems generate candidates, right? Most of it's going to be instrumental. We're all going to try to be troubleshooting it and scratching our heads. And the concern is how do we make a nice optical SETI network, a group of individuals where you have a candidate, you're scratching your head, you're trying to figure it out, but you shouldn't sit on it, right? You don't want to rush to New York Times. It's probably false. So it really does take, some deep sensitivity to the public culture to this, the scientific landscape that we have to deal with in the SETI community and the broader astronomical community. So it's more challenging than a GRB, FRB, or whatever other follow-up you want to do. So but it would be great if our, each of our programs could connect and have this where there is a safety net and we can be real-time sending out candidates. I think there takes a little bit of coordination and thought here on this because we can't ignore the cultural perceptions of SETI here.
Yeah, you can't say, oh, we have a SETI candidate network. It's like, oh my goodness.
Shelley, I wonder if it's better to say this is a transient candidate and not, then you don't attract the press so much.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I just wanted to add the other layer of complication to this.
Yeah, and maybe not call it an optical SETI network, just call it, transient network.
Yeah. So David and then Beatrice had their hands up.
Yeah, so I think Shelley's point is really important, and in terms of how we share these things without them getting out of hand. And I think in the multi-messenger community, there are a lot of memorandum of understanding, bilateral, multilateral, for sharing of information. And I think we might need something that's a bit more like that, where rather than just sort of putting things out in some place, in some way that they become quasi-public, that we have some arrangements for sharing things among ourselves, that where we appreciate the sensitivity and we respect the confidentiality that's needed in order for the science to proceed.
Mm-hmm. Beatrice, and I think Lucienne and Jill.
I was just wondering if it's possible to create some type of database where all the, let's say, rejected or no longer interesting candidates are dumped, so that every project dumps their candidates there so that they're saved somewhere together, because it's possible that something that every project is ignoring actually ends up being the same thing or the same coordinate in various projects that just gets rejected. And it could be nice to have a common waste bin or something like that. Just one thought.
Yeah, that's a good idea, but the issue is different instruments will have different sensitivity and then different wavelength that they're sensitive to. So it doesn't mean that you reject it in this wavelength. It might not be interesting in other wavelengths. So I think we should keep in mind that just, instead of having a rejected candidate, we can just put being observed by XYZ observatory.
Lucienne?
Yeah, I want to draw out a couple things that on Beatrice's comment and also Shelley's. So one, I think having sort of the database of null results is actually a great idea. Not because it necessarily needs to have any kind of binary labeling of not interesting or interesting, but in the exoplanet community, right? All of the ways that we coordinate follow-up of candidate exoplanets, I think actually provides a pretty good roadmap because there's lots of existing infrastructure that collates observations, sort of transient, where I mean transients as in updatable labels as to whether something is confirmed or statistically confirmed or rejected or, an identified false positive, et cetera. And having that kind of transparency within the community would be really helpful. I do think one question here, and I appreciate your remarks, Shelley, about like sort of the public facing side of things, but also a very common theme in all of our meetings is the fact that we want to move this into something that is a viable career path for people who are junior and entering the field. And you know, historically, a lot of sort of the I guess like agita over over like candidates, et cetera, is facilitated by attempts to keep things closed. And I actually think that there might be worthwhileness to having more transparency about candidates, their status, follow-up observations, not only because it would help the community, but also because it might normalize some of the work that we are doing instead of trying to kind of keep it out of the hands of the press and the public. Because one of the things, like when we're in like these closed sessions where we're sort of talking amongst ourselves, are always like, oh, and then we're going to like find the signal that's going to change everything. Most of the American populace thinks aliens are visiting the planet. Like statistically, most people already think aliens have been found. So, you know, I think being maybe a little less precious with public perception, and I know that's like anathema from the history of SETI, but maybe being a little less precious in the effort of making more transparency and exposing the process a little bit more might be something that's worth considering.
I will note that the press treatment of BLC1, despite it getting out early and visibly, was actually quite good. I was generally quite pleased with how they handled it and what they said. Jill?
Yeah, I'm disturbed by the potential of all of the folks that are on this call with, you know, willingness and eagerness to participate in something. And I think that follow-up is too late. I think what should be organized is a way of having multiple instruments looking at the same piece of sky at the same time in order to validate transients is something we really should be thinking about.
I think that is the ideal we would all evolve towards. Basically a pan-OSETI at every wavelength.
Right, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about following up what site A saw by site B, C, and D. I think, you know, before we ever get to the candidate stage, we ought to have something that has been seen simultaneously by 2 or more observing platforms.
So I don't at all disagree with that, but it makes me wonder how we utilize facilities which are truly unique. We don't have 2 test missions. We don't have two LSSTs. So I think there must be some way of balancing that.
I think that's a good point. You know, pan-OSETI has 2 domes. We detect it hopefully in both, but I think Jill would advocate that it be a different instrument along the lines of what you're saying, James, and different software, different people. That makes it a much more robust correlation.
So this is why I proposed a campaign, a unified campaign.
Well, but I think temporally we want more time in the sky as opposed to a week a year where everyone points to the same thing. So I think Jim phrased it wonderfully well. You know, there are a lot of balances to trade off, and there'll probably be a large distribution of efforts. So I think one of the underlying things we spent some time on is, okay, we're going to have this wide distribution of effort. Some are going to be small, some will only be able to follow up on things. You know, how can we organize, that full banquet? Steve?
Another thing to bear in mind is, once we start getting into the parameter space where events that we're interested in exist, then we should not just expect to see one of them. So, if you have one candidate and it goes away and you never see it again, that's one thing. But I think sort of doing pushing out into these different dimensions of the search space haystack is going to give us a good chance of sort of starting to see interesting anomalies. And then if it really does look like the anomalies live in a certain region of that parameter space, then we can focus the follow-up on the best method to characterize them.
David?
We are making small steps in the direction that Jill was advocating a moment ago, as Howard mentioned in his talk yesterday. Just last night, we spent an hour with Veritas and the APF looking at the same objects at the same time.
All right, so I think the key thing from speaking of follow-up, the key thing from this workshop, since we are essentially at the end of the time, is to figure out means of following up. And I know this has been something that John has put together and has thought about. So I think we are at the end of this session. So John, if you want to kind of wrap up the discussion, and then we'll come up with means that we can continue the dialogue.
Yeah, sure. So I guess one or two key ideas from this workshop is the broker that we can put more information out there to the community. And then the second idea that we would like to work on is either to from that broker to schedule some follow observation, or step by step we can look at different same parts of the sky with using the two different telescopes, two different locations to see whether we can just start observing at multi-frequency. So I think that one of the two ideas that are really exciting that will come out from this workshop. So I'm not sure whether we have any other pressing thoughts or ideas that we would like to bring out there, or let me just conclude this workshop today. First of all, thank you everybody who put their time and effort and ideas into this workshop. It's a really great move forward. As Paul mentioned, that it started from a very cozy group, and we expand to like more and more collaboration, and people are more interested in optical SETI after just a small time of 5 years. And let's just not think of this as a closing of this workshop, but just a start of a new collaboration with the optical SETI. So yeah, I'm not sure whether Andrew, you are here, that you would like to add some other final words, or we can just thanks everybody, and I will go back to searching for more candidate signal.
All right. Well, I think we can. Yeah, I think we can go ahead and wrap up. And thank you, everyone, for some amazing discussion. It's been a fantastic couple of days and very interesting. And we hope we will see you physically, in person, and in hybrid modes over the coming years to further the research.
Just before folks sign off, I wanted to mention that our government relations office just emailed us the Senate Commerce NASA bill text is out, and technosignatures are in there. The administrative shall support activities to search for and analyze technosignatures. We still need to get appropriations on this, but I would encourage folks, particularly since the needle is moving on that, to think about putting in proposals. It's one thing to be lobbying for the availability of funding, but I think all of these great ideas that are coming up today, particularly for US-based folks, and for those of you overseas collaborating with us, let's talk about getting proposals in and having some more bites of the apple.
Thank you, John, and Steve, and Dave, and Karen, and all the speakers. We really appreciate it. It's a great workshop.
All right. Well, take care, everybody. We'll
see you. Hopefully.
Thank you.
Thanks for the invitation. Ciao. See you next time.
Cheers. Very valuable. Thanks a lot, organizers and speakers.